Hey everybody, on this episode 381 of the podcast, I take two awesome listener questions that are very different from each other. In the first one, I talked to a newly licensed therapist who made the jump to private practice from community-based mental health, but they're finding that the lack of stability is very difficult and they're not sure if they kind of need to lick their wounds and go back to the previous setting. So I share my personal experiences with this, as well as some pitfalls to avoid and some creative ways to make the situation work. In the second question, as I said, very different, I talked to somebody about their driving anxiety. And this isn't about general driving anxiety or a general driving phobia. It's a very specific sort of situation. And so this was a great opportunity to dive into how to get exposure and work through anxiety for a very specific sort of trigger. So I hope you enjoy. Let's go. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a clinical psychologist and a self-help author from Southern California. My goal is to make mental health content for real people, just like you. And in this show, I answer your questions or dive deep into topics related to life, psychology, mental health, relationships, and more. Please be aware that sometimes I use some spicy language, and I also don't shy away from sensitive topics, but I will try to give you a content warning whenever it's relevant. So if all this sounds good to you, let's get started. All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you're doing well. This has been an interesting time of year from my observation. I'm noticing that a lot of people out there are having various mood episodes. This could be for some depression and a lot of heaviness, sort of recuperating from the holiday season, so to speak. But I'm also noticing a huge uptick in like mania and hypomania among people that have those sort of mood episodes. This is, from my clinical perspective, as well as seeing people online, as well as seeing people in my personal life. I'm not exactly sure the reason for this. I think it may just be sort of a seasonal thing. Could also be related to sort of, like I said, coming off the holiday season. There's plenty of stuff going on in the world to serve as fuel for that, etc. But I'm just noticing a big uptick there. So if you are somebody who tends to have, mood episodes of one type or another, I think it's a really good time for you to check in on yourself, to check in on your basics like sleep and nutrition, and to make sure that you have a good system in place for getting some feedback from others around you, your family members, your friends, your providers, whatever it might be, just to make sure that, you're in the eye of the storm, but you have people on the outside who can also let you know if they notice things that are going on that you might not be aware of. I also wanted to mention, just before going into the questions here, a quick strategy, one that's been working really well for me right now in my personal life. And that strategy is just sort of a little back pocket question that I ask myself, which is, says who? This has been a way for me to kind of challenge some of the arbitrary rules that I have in my mind. We all do this, right? We all make up kind of arbitrary rules. Oh, well, I can't do this because I have something else coming up tonight. Or, I already, talked to this person, so I can't go back and ask another question. Things like this. These are, obviously random examples, but, for me, I've been trying to challenge myself to just do things a little bit differently. Like, why not? So, for example, this past weekend, I was in LA with my kids, and I wanted to take them to the La Brea Tar Pits, which is in LA. It's a museum. They have a bunch of fossils of, like saber-toothed cats and mammoths and things like that, as well as a few different little activities. And it had been forever since I'd been there, since probably I was a kid, and they were interested in going. But the thing is, by the time we kind of got ourselves together and were going to be going, it was already fairly late, and it was only like an hour until it closed. And in my mind, I had the automatic response of, we don't need to do that today because it's going to be closing soon anyway. And so I, thought to myself, well, says who, right? It says who? Why should we not do that? And so we went, and it turned out that there was, only about an hour's worth of entertainment there for the kids, but they really enjoyed it. And they played outside afterward. We sat on the grass outside and watched the sunset, and then we took off, and it was wonderful. Same thing goes for stuff like walking my dog or exercising, getting my workouts in. In my mind, there are specific times when it's okay to do those things. But like, why can't I walk the dog for the 30 minutes before dinner or something like that? Why can't I exercise, actually after the kids go to bed? Something like that. And so it's just been really helpful, a little rule of thumb for me to notice when I'm making those assumptions and limiting myself, and then go, says who, right? Why does that have to be true? So maybe you can think about where you would like to apply that in your life, but it's been helping me out quite a bit. But all that said, why don't we go ahead and jump into the questions? There are 2 questions here. If you want to send me in a question for the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or use the contact form on my website, duffthepsych.com. Here is the first one. It reads, "Hello, I'm a new listener and recently heard an October episode in which you shared some anxieties and concerns about working at a group private practice. I'm a newly licensed as of September 23 and started a private practice in November 2023. I used to work for a community-based nonprofit agency and was underpaid and unhappy there. I thought private practice was the way to go, and it turns out that the inconsistency in work and my pay, as well as the lack of benefits, has caused my anxiety to spike. I'm doing some contract work and hope that this will relieve some of my anxiety, but deep down, I think I may not be cut out for this, and I will have to return to a full-time job, along with the long hours and high caseloads. I'm really questioning if I will ever reap the rewards of all the time and effort I put into my career. I was wondering if you could speak more on anxieties that we as therapists and mental health professionals experience. Any tips that I could use to help overcome imposter syndrome as a newly licensed private practice clinician, as well as provide some updates on your career. Some suggestions for how to arrive at a decision would be helpful as well. Thank you." All right. Well, hey, thank you for writing this question in. It's a super good question. And I know this is somewhat niche, given the topic and the specific career. But I also know there are a disproportionate amount of mental health professionals or aspiring mental health professionals that listen to the show. So I wanted to take it. And obviously, I have my own personal connection to this. So first off, what I wanted to say is congratulations. I know how long a road it is to, work your way toward licensure, all of the hours they have to put in, pre and post, and, not to mention school and all the hoops you have to jump through and the money you have to pay. I would never want to go back to that part of my professional journey, and I can't imagine having to go through it right now. So yeah, I just want to say congratulations. It's really cool that you were able to do that. Also, I wanted to say you are not alone in this situation. Basically, what it sounds like you're saying is you went from one situation that was not good for you, and then now you find yourself in another one that you thought would be better, but you've essentially traded, one type of issue for another type of issue, and neither of those really give you that balance you're looking for. So previously, you were in community mental health, and community-based mental health certainly differs from place to place, but I would say that it's pretty common to have that experience, especially when you're a boots on the ground clinician, where you're overworked and underpaid, and it's truly a labor of love. You're doing it because maybe you're good at it, but also you want to make a difference, and it's an opportunity that was there, but it's tough. It's really hard. But now you're in private practice and you're encountering, the detractors that are associated with that. Things like not having benefits like health insurance or paid time off, not having the same sort of security that comes from working for a larger organization where, you get paid whether or not somebody shows up, as long as you're not a contractor. And as you mentioned, I can definitely relate to that latter part. In the podcast recently, I talked about the fact that I'm kind of considering potentially a change in my career path because of the issues that are related to working in private practice, right? If referrals aren't coming in for a period of time, or I'm having a lot of no-shows, that means that money's not being put on the table. And that sounds like it's the case for you as well. And of course, there are many industries where this is also the case, right? It's not just therapy, but anybody who is doing a kind of contract-based, individual, one-on-one, hands-on kind of work, it can be a very tough thing to balance because you have no assurance that you're going to have people coming in and needing your service. So, for this situation, I have a few things to say about it. First off, I want to reassure you that it's totally normal to have doubts or to be unsure of your current path. It's also really common for people to make changes in their career, I don't think we talk about that enough, but even, later on in life, even after establishing themselves in a certain career, there are various estimates for how many times somebody changes their career path in their life, but you would be surprised. It's very common to make a shift, whether it's laterally or going to, a different setting altogether. It is common. So you're not doing anything wrong. You're not alone in this. You could potentially go back and forth a few times between working in different settings. You could try a combination of both. You can try something different altogether. And even with all of that, still find that in the end, you've had a fulfilling and successful life. And maybe you've even made a good living for yourself. So I just want you to start the process of trying to break free from the sort of shoulds of the situation. Every situation is different, and you're not doing anything wrong here. I also want you to have some grace with yourself and recognize that just because you can't make this sort of idealized version of what being a private practice therapist, looks like, just because you can't make that work right now, that doesn't mean that you aren't cut out for it, that you weren't made for it, that you can't make that happen. There are so many different ways that a career can look. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Let me first take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. All right, this episode is brought to you by OneSkin. I know that a lot of you guys out there are looking for ways to improve yourself here in the new year, and sometimes the simplest changes are the most impactful. So you might want to check out OneSkin because they have a 2-step approach to healthier skin that's backed by science. They have a scientifically proven peptide called OS1, and this peptide targets lines and wrinkles right at the source, which is your actual cells. It isn't just a skincare routine focused on moisturization, but it's actually a scientific breakthrough that allows you to turn back the clock and reduce signs of aging. They did a 12-week clinical study, and this was performed by an independent organization, and it was clinically proven to strengthen the skin barrier, improve skin health markers, and diminish visible signs of aging like wrinkles. Wrinkles were diminished in 87% of users in this 12-week clinical study. So they stand by their product. They have a lot of amazing stuff for your face, for your eye, for your body, for the sun. They even have travel size products. They come in a nice package. The actual products themselves look very stylish, perfect for sitting on your nightstand or in your bathroom. So you should check them out. OneSkin is the world's first skin longevity company. And by focusing on the cellular aspects of aging, they keep your skin looking active and younger for longer. Get started today with 15% off using the code DUFF, D-U-F-F, at oneskin.co. That's 15% off at oneskin.co with the code DUFF. As I was mentioning, there are various ways that a career can look. And personally, I've had my struggles and complaints about working in a small group private practice. But, I've also been making over 6 figures since I was in my 20s. Now, in 2024, that's obviously something that doesn't mean a whole lot because the world is fucking expensive. It's outrageous, but it's also nothing to sneeze at, right? That's a marker that a lot of people set for themselves. So, definitely there is success to be found here. It just depends on what you're looking for and how you want to live your life. So for you, it seems to me that there are 2 aspects to the approach here. One is to work on your perception of things and your mental health. The other is to figure out a good way for you to make the money that you need to survive and get through. Because it sounds like there's some perhaps all or nothing thinking going on here. Essentially, you said that you don't feel like private practice is sustainable for you. So you feel like you're going to have to go back to working this full-time job with high hours, big caseloads, and essentially, working yourself to the bone. And I think that there are other options of this. It's not that dichotomy. It's not one or the other. Especially early in your career, which you're not totally locked into a specialization. For myself, for example, I have training in childhood assessment, but for years I've been doing adult neuropsychology, primarily with older adults. And so it would be hard for me to make a sudden shift to a totally different population to work with. Doesn't mean I'm not necessarily qualified to do so, but my resume doesn't look like that's what I've been doing. And I would, of course, need to bone up on certain assessment tools, get some additional training and stuff like that. So, it is easier when you're earlier in your career and you have more room to sort of explore. I'm not going to go into all of the details and possibilities here because I don't want the entire audience to fall asleep while we talk, psychology inside baseball. But there are various types of group practices. There's in-person practices or remote or hybrid. Some of these group practices for, more established practices, they do provide benefits. There are also organizations which are larger but don't require you to sell your soul quite as much. For example, working in a large healthcare organization in your area rather than community-based mental health, that might keep you busy, but not work to the bone because, healthcare organizations like a hospital system or something like that, they're often going to have more limits on what they, do because they are held accountable as well. So it's not going to be that same sort of thing where it's a true labor of love and you're just really working yourself to death. If you're trying to make it work in your own private practice and that's not a group practice setting, maybe you need to find some resources, things related to advertising, things related to client acquisition, more stuff on the business side of things. How about insurance credentialing, group therapy, getting signed up with organizations that can provide referrals? There are a lot of potentials to tweak here. So there's a lot of possibility for you. I think that you have also stumbled upon already a very awesome and underutilized option, which is you don't just have to do one thing. In your case right now, you picked up some contract work, and that's something that you can definitely use to fill in the gaps. For me, the best way to fill in the gaps has been through my other projects, things like writing books, things like this podcast. In the past, I used to make more income from YouTube. I made my online course, things like that, things people might consider side hustles, but really, at times in my career, my non-clinical work, not direct client work, was the primary driver of my income. These days, it's the opposite. Clinical work is more lucrative for me than, my outside projects, but that can very well shift again in the future. And as I think about it, I have therapist friends who are yoga teachers or, psychologist friends who also do house sitting or dog sitting. I have friends that teach at the university level or otherwise, in addition to clinical work. There are people that run retreats. There are people that serve as advisors on boards that do coaching, or people that have online shops that may or may not be associated with what they actually do as a therapist, right? So there's a lot of other things there. I'm not saying that you have to hedge and not really put all into your clinical practice, into your private practice, but there are multiple options, and it's not all the stuff that you learned about in school. Only you will be able to figure out what that balance is that's required to be able to both support yourself and also maintain your mental health. But I will tell you that it's not worth destroying yourself over. If going back to community-based mental health is going to kill your soul and be detrimental to your physical and emotional health, then don't do it. Don't fucking do it, right? Find another way. It's not worth it. Maybe at some point in time, you'll feel called to do that and you'll feel like you're strong enough to. But right now, if it's going to drain you, now's not the time for that. So find a different way. And it's okay if the path that you take right now, immediately from here, ends up not being the perfect one for you in the end. I want to reassure you that not all therapists and mental health professionals are miserable, right? There are many people that find good balance in their careers, but it might take a little bit of trial and error, and that's totally okay. So keep your eyes open, talk to other people, make connections, try some experiments. You're going to be all right. And when it comes to the question of how to arrive at decisions, right? A decision of, do I continue on my current course? Do I kind of lick my wounds and go back to what I was doing before? This would be difficult for me to give you specific advice about because a lot of this has to do with your place in life, right? How much do you need to make? Are you responsible for anybody other than yourself? A partner or dependents? Things like this are definitely pieces of the puzzle, and that's stuff that you're going to need to evaluate for yourself. But when you're younger, when you're earlier in your career, typically you do have more flexibility and room to experiment. So this might be a great opportunity to capitalize on that. Talk to your colleagues about it. If you have trusted personal advisors outside of the field, they can also be really beneficial. Your therapist, if you have one. So I think that, those are some ideas to get you thinking about different creative ways or what you can do from your standpoint to move forward without just going back and burning yourself out. Last thing I'll mention before closing up this question is just an update about my situation since you asked. Right now, no major change since last time I talked about it. Because my work is so specialized as a neuropsychologist, there aren't like a bunch of jobs that pop up all the time. And so right now there are some opportunities that I'm pursuing. Nothing has panned out yet, but otherwise I just sort of have my radar up. I have, job alerts on, looking for things, frequently. I don't want to move very far. So that does also limit things. I have kind of like a I don't know, I guess roughly 100-mile altogether radius that I would like to work within in person, because this is kind of more hands-on work rather than something I could do remotely like therapy. So yeah, I'm kind of just trying to be patient. And in the meantime, I'm focused on adapting and trying to take advantage of my current situation as best as I can. I'm really grateful that right now I have multiple things that I can focus on, because it's sort of like sliders. If one thing is slowing down, I can up the slider on another thing and focus more on that. So maybe that's writing, maybe that is putting more into social media or the podcast, maybe that is working on a new project, etc. And if it doesn't work out, then I'm able to find something that better fits with my hopes for my life and my career right now. There are still other options, right? I can consolidate more time to focus just on testing and really bang out a lot of that. I can push for networking more with people in a specific field like the forensic world and try to get more work in that capacity. I can advertise my private practice more and try to build up my therapy caseload more. Or I can just block out some time and take a little sabbatical and just knock out some projects and try to generate more passive income. So there are options, and the important thing for me personally is just to not get too stuck in the minutia or stuck waiting for something to happen, like waiting to hear back about something, and so stuck that I forget the actions that I can take right now that are right in front of me. So hopefully these thoughts are helpful to you. I know they're not fully applicable to everybody, but I'm sure regardless of what industry you're in, some of these things sound familiar, or some of these things are getting you thinking about your situation. Resist the urge to engage in that all or nothing thinking. There are a lot of potential paths for you. So thank you for the question. All right, on to the next question. This one is totally different than the previous one, but also great. It reads, Dr. Duff, I have a unique situation. I experience anxiety driving on the highway, but usually only around 1.5 to 2 hours. It's strange because there are times that I choose to take an alternative route, the back roads, which adds 45 minutes to an hour of time, and I'm fine. These back roads have multiple 55-mile-an-hour roads, so it's not the speed. I have had epilepsy since I was 12, but fortunately it's well controlled, currently on the generic for Keppra. I don't think it's related because I've been driving since age 15 and I've never had an issue. I did have an instance while on a family trip in Colorado. We drove up Pikes Peak. Well, I attempted. I got us up to 12,000 feet, 12,000 feet, and started to feel anxious. I pulled into a parking lot. We called the ranger and they drove us back down to the checkpoint, which was below the tree line. I figured it was the altitude. Not sure if this incident is related. During my quest to overcome the situation, I read multiple articles suggesting that it could be something with the eyes. Went to a specialist who deals with that for a 3-month program, and unfortunately it didn't help. Our girls play sports and require out-of-state travel. If my wife can't go, I have to take them. Last year, I was able to go with another family, but this season's going to be different. Not to mention, I don't want to have to rely on somebody else. Some drives are over 7 hours. I was wondering if you have a podcast or recommendations with my situation. I know that there are others who have a phobia about driving. I don't. I like it. It's only those longer drives, which is extremely frustrating. I haven't found any help specifically for my situation. Thank you. Hi, thank you. This is a really good question, and it's a unique one. I like this because we all at this point probably know some of the basics of, how to deal with anxiety, how to deal with even phobias. But what happens when you have this very kind of unique, specialized situation where it only comes up in that situation and not generally while you're driving? What you're saying here is that you don't have a phobia overall. You don't have significant anxiety about driving in general. It's only when you get to that 1.5 to 2 hour mark that the anxiety kicks in. And for most people, this wouldn't really be an issue, right? If that was for me, it would hardly ever come up. But you are recognizing that it's a limitation in your life because you're going to need to transport your kids out of state for sports at times and drive sometimes over 7 hours. So yeah, that sounds super frustrating for you. And the situation overall sounds frustrating because it sounds like you've tried hard to figure this out. You've kind of done what you can to identify the specifics of the situation, right? It's not your eyes. It's not the speed. It's just the highway, not the back roads, but only sometimes. So yeah, I'm sorry that you've been stuck like this, and I hope that I can help out a little bit. In terms of why this is happening, I would have to say that my best guess is that this probably has had some sort of triggering event that started it off. And then your body took that and overgeneralized that anxiety response to situations that are reminiscent of that initial event. And then sometimes anxiety does this really awesome thing where it'll make up an anxiety trigger simply because it's kind of already an anxiety trigger, right? Like the longer it's an issue, the worse the issue becomes. And then you start to worry about the fact that you're never going to be able to fix the issue, and the stakes seem higher and on, and it's sort of self-perpetuating. Now, I do think there are a few fundamentals that could probably help and a few things to try out, which may be different from the way that you're approaching it so far. So first off, what I would say is to think about some stuff. When you encounter that anxiety while driving, so when you hit that long distance, that long time, and the anxiety kicks in, I would ask you to consider what happens. What actually happens, right? A lot of times anxiety feels scary and it feels dangerous, but it actually isn't. You probably feel, in this case, a greater degree of risk and responsibility because you're carrying your children in the car. And that would be a prompt for you to be extra careful, which anxiety loves, right? It loves feeling like the stakes are high. But what actually happens, literally speaking, right? When you're feeling anxiety, what happens to you? Do you have trouble seeing? Does your body go rigid? Have you ever hit anything or had any really close near misses? Has anybody else ever told you that you're driving erratically or strangely? Have there been any practical consequences at any point for this anxiety? Right? I don't already know the answers to these. I'm not like leading you on here. I would just challenge you to ask yourself those questions and figure out, is your anxiety even really a problem while you're driving, right? Not whether or not you have that anxiety. I'm not questioning that. Obviously you do. But what does it matter if you have that anxiety while you're driving, right? Aside from discomfort, is it having any practical impact? In other words, I just want to make sure that you're not solving for a problem that isn't there. You're totally allowed to want to reduce your anxiety because, you'd rather be more comfortable and anxiety sucks. But don't convince yourself that you're unsafe if you actually are safe. Another question would be, when the anxiety comes on, what do you do about it? Do you try to push through? Do you immediately stop, right? 1.5 to 2 hours at least is a long time to drive. And I'm wondering what would happen if, say, you were driving for 2 hours and then anxiety came on, and instead of turning back or instead of, pushing through, you stopped for, say, 30 minutes to an hour, right? Grabbed a coffee or something to eat, walked around for a little bit, and then got back on the road again, basically trying to reset the clock, so to speak. So you're starting from 0 instead of starting from 2 hours. That's just, one potential. I'm not sure if you've tried that or not. For some people, trying to focus on dealing with the problem is helpful. Things like listening to guided relaxations or calming music, things where you're actually trying to kind of lower your nervous system. But for others, distractions like loud music or having the windows down or conversation with somebody else, podcasts, audiobooks, things like that are more helpful to sort of distract them. Overall, the thing we want to avoid most is avoidance, right? We want to avoid the avoidance. And I won't lie, this one is a little bit tricky in the exposure department because it's such a specific situation that brings about the anxiety, right? It's not totally feasible to drive a 3-hour round trip, excursion every day to work on your anxiety. But I do think there are a few things that we can do in the exposure department that could help. And this is where I need to jump in and say, working with a therapist that works with phobias and anxiety disorders would be so valuable, right? Because they can take your actual situation, they can help you tweak things, they can develop experiments, and they can really get you moving in the right direction in a way that would accelerate the process for you. So if you haven't looked into that, now might be a great time. If I were in your shoes, one thing that I would want to do is try to schedule some time coming up to focus on getting some long drive exposure. Ideally, this would be with another person in the car. It could be your wife, it could be a friend, anybody that can drive, and anybody that could, take over if absolutely necessary. And this wouldn't be for something like a sports trip or some other really important reason. We don't want the stakes to actually be super high, right? You don't want to have the risk of, ruining a trip for somebody. But I just mean a trip to actually allow yourself to intentionally invite the kind of anxiety that you described in your question. Of course, you can make it fun, right? Maybe you can find a restaurant that's, pretty far away, or maybe there's some people that you can go have a day trip and visit that are pretty far away. And the idea would be that you intentionally push yourself to that 1.5, 2 hour mark whenever the anxiety pops up. And then when that anxiety pops up, instead of stopping or escaping and turning around, stopping for help, whatever, you keep going. And I don't mean, another 2 exits or something like that. I mean, you keep going for half an hour or an hour or more. You keep going until it's no longer an issue, ideally. And the point of the other person in the car is to, help provide that outside perspective and reassurance that you're not going to suddenly wreck the car or something like that, right? That you're doing fine. They're not noticing anything. Everything's okay. And they're there if you absolutely need it. Now, let's say that your body learned that driving for long trips means danger due to that experience you had on Pikes Peak, right? What you need to do is give your body the chance to unlearn that. You need to give your body the chance to realize that anxiety is lying to you, that being in the car for that long does not mean danger. Now, as a proxy for this, if you don't have an opportunity to get a lot of long drives in, this may sound silly, but there are some really great simulator games out there. Like if you have a computer and you could pick up, say, just a little cheap steering wheel, there are, for instance, like truck driving simulator where you can go on long haul drives and be, focused on the process of driving on the highway virtually for, hours at a time. That could potentially be something very interesting to try. I know this is a lot of time sunk into it, which, you may or may not have, but it is an option here. Another thing to try would be to work on the exposure side internally, what we call interoceptive exposure, meaning the feelings that anxiety generates in your body and getting more used to those, right? So as I said earlier, when you get to that point in the drive where the anxiety kicks in, what does that feel like? What particular experiences, symptoms, sensations do you have? And if you can pinpoint those, then you can simulate them in a safe environment like your home and learn to better tolerate them, right? And you could even do this in a safe setting with the car, right? If you go to the parking lot of a big church or something like that on a day that they don't have church. I don't know why church came to mind. I feel like a lot of people learn to drive in church parking lots. But closed course, nobody's there. You could generate some of the feelings that do come up and then show yourself that you still know how to drive, right? So I'm thinking you could breathe through a small straw while you're driving around the parking lot to show that even if you feel like you can't breathe super well, you're still able to drive, right? And at home, without driving, you could do things that are related to interoceptive exposure, like hyperventilating intentionally, like spinning around in a chair, like wearing something heavy on your chest so it feels like you can't breathe very well, overheating yourself intentionally, with a space heater. Whatever your anxiety does to you, try to mimic that. And the idea here is to help you understand that the internal sensations of anxiety don't actually imply that there's a real threat there, and that you're going to be able to withstand whatever feelings come up without totally losing it. And this can help because when they pop up during a drive, when you have those feelings, you're not as derailed by them, right? You expected them and you're kind of used to them. So you're not going to get that secondary layer of anxiety where you're afraid of the fact that you're anxious. You're used to it. It's like, oh, here it is. I knew that was coming. Well, I already know that that's not the end of the world. I wish it wasn't this way, but let's see what happens. And you keep driving, right? So those are a few tips for you, some areas of further exploration, a lot of questions for you to consider. And of course, as I said, if you can work with a therapist, that'll make it even better. So I really hope that helps. And that's what I have for you guys. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. If you would like to send a question or a topic for a future episode, please email me at duffthepsych@gmail.com. If you like my approach and would like to learn more about my books, online course, or other resources, please head over to my website at duffthepsych.com. And lastly, it would mean so much to me if you would leave a review for the podcast wherever you listen to it, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, you got this.